Booksmith for this event and all the great programming they bring into our neighborhood. I met Tamim Ansary virtually shortly after 9/11, 2001, when a friend of mine forwarded his widely circulated email, which was a response to a call to bomb Afghanistan into Stone Age. That email was intended for 25 of Tamim's close friends, but it reached millions of people around the world and gained Tamim international prominence and got him on the Bill Moyers Show, the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, the Oprah Winfrey Show, Hardball, and numerous national public radio stations. The message in his email is timeless. It called in the US to bring positive political change to Afghanistan. I'll read you a short excerpt which still applies to current events today. So this is the email, or part of it. New bombs would only stir the rubble of earlier bombs. Would they at least get the Taliban? Not likely. In today's Afghanistan, only the Taliban eat. Only they have the means to move around. They slip away and hide. Maybe the bombs would get some of those disabled orphans. They don't move too fast. They don't even have wheelchairs. But flying over Kabul and dropping bombs wouldn't really be a strike against the criminal who did this horrific thing. Actually, it would only be making common cause with the Taliban by raping, once again, the people they've been raping all this time. I had the good fortune to meet Tamim in person in 2003 when he got involved with Afghan Friends Network. We discovered quickly that his father was friends with my father's uncle while they were studying in the United States, and we became fast friends. Tamin is one of the most generous people I know with his time, and if you are lucky enough to get his email and ask him for help, he will respond. I've been just really amazed by that. He's a thought leader in the Afghan community and really cherished by everyone who seeks any guidance on policy or anything that they want to do in Afghanistan. I am not going to tell you much more. This is not your traditional intro, because I want each and every one of you to buy a copy of his book, West of Kabul, East of New York, because it's a memoir, and you'll learn a lot more about Tamin that way. And it's one of my favorite books that I've been recommending to everyone around anyone who I would meet, and I'm really, really excited that the San Francisco Public Library has chosen it as part of One City, One Book. So here we have Tamim.
Thank you to Booksmith, thank you to the committee that chose my book in San Francisco, and thank you, Humaira John. You guys should know more about Afghan Friends Network. You know, their core project is something really cool, which is sending people to Afghanistan to teach science teachers how to teach science, rather than sending people to teach students how to, rather than teaching students science. So it's kind of this multiplier effect. Did I get that about right? I think it's really neat. Well, I think maybe I will read a little bit from my book today, and then I'll talk a little bit, and then you guys can ask whatever questions you want. And I hope you'll ask questions, because that always gets livelier than me talking. I'll just read the first couple of pages, and you know what? I need to put on a different pair of glasses. The good thing is I remembered my hearing aids today, and also I remembered my reading glasses. So this book came out in 2002, actually, so we're a little ways on from that. But maybe I'll tell you this little bit about myself and the point of departure for this book. You can read more about it by buying the book. But just to establish the premise here, my mother was the first American woman to marry an Afghan and live in Afghanistan. And she was that because my father was among the first sets of students who were sent abroad by the Afghan government to get an education in the United States. There were 2 batches of 5 before him, and then he was in the 3rd group, and he was told not to marry a foreigner, but of the 5 who came, he was the first to break that rule, and so they called him back to Afghanistan. And so I grew up in a house, in an environment where when I went home, in the core of my home, it was sort of a little simulacrum of Afghanistan. When I left the house, I went to school or any place else, it was Afghanistan as far as the eye could see. Later on, the rest of these 5 guys also married their American girlfriends and came back with American wives. And so they changed the rules and said, well, I guess that's okay. And you know, Humaira's uncle's friend, or however we're related, Kaka Shalizi, he married an Indian woman, but he married her there. And so they set up they kind of set up a neighborhood where, by some coincidence, all these guys ended up in that neighborhood, and we had a little tiny Afghan-American community. Well, let me read the beginning of this, because I recollect what it was like. You know, I'm going back to my recollections of Afghanistan when I was in my earliest memories. In 1948, when I was born, most of Afghanistan might as well have been living in Neolithic times. It was a world of walled villages, each one inhabited by a few large families, themselves linked in countless ways through intermarriages stretching into the dim historical memories of the eldest elders. These villages had no cars, no carts even, no wheeled vehicles at all, no stores, no shops, no electricity, no postal service, and no media except rumors, storytelling, and the word of travelers passing through. Virtually all the men were farmers. Virtually all the women ran the households and raised the children. Virtually all boys grew up to be like their fathers, and all girls like their mothers. The broad patterns of life never changed, never had, as far as any living generation could remember, and presumably never would. People lived pretty much as they had 8,000 years ago. That was the countryside. The big cities, such as Kandahar and Mazar-e-Sharif, were living in the 15th century or so. And the biggest city, Kabul, where my family lived, had made it to the 20th century, but just barely. Cars were few, roads were unpaved, and public transportation consisted mostly of gaudis, horse-drawn, 2-wheeled carriages. Electricity was scarce too. Most of us used kerosene lanterns at night. There was no running water. We all had wells. There was no garbage service. We didn't produce any garbage. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in the city, but the houses had no numbers and the streets had no names. If you didn't know where you were going, you probably had no business going there. A postal service existed, but it didn't deliver to private homes unless the mailman felt like it, and he felt like it only if he knew you or had heard of you. Yet even with hundreds of thousands of people in the city, the postman very probably had heard of you. Oh, not you in particular. You were just a leaf, a bud. He'd know the branch, the trunk, the tree itself, your people. Everybody in the city lived in a compound, a yard surrounded by walls that divided the world into a public and a private realm. That's the main fact I want to get across about the lost world I grew up in. It was not divided into a men's world and a women's world. The division was between public and private. Visitors never really knew us because they never saw the hidden world inside our compounds. Those who came from the West didn't even know that our private universe existed or that life inside it was warm and sweet. And in a way, we Afghans didn't know we had this realm either because we didn't know it was possible not to have it. In the compounds, people spent all their time with the group. As far as I can tell, none of my Afghan relatives was ever alone or ever wanted to be. And that's so different from my life today here in the West. And that's so different from my life here today, here in the West. Because I write for a living, I spend most of my waking hours alone in my basement office. Oh, I jog, do errands, see people I know, but mostly it's just a man and his thoughts in a blur of urban landscape.